All right. Welcome to this roundtable to celebrate 50 years of the Association for Mormon Letters. We are here with several past presidents, a few founders of AML, and we are going to discuss the development of Mormon literature and the history of the Association for Mormon Letters. We're going to get started with Levi Peterson, one of the founding members of AML, past president, board member, conference chair, and we'll hear from Levi, and then after him, we'll hear from Bruce Jorgensen, another founding member. So go ahead, Levi.
All right, I will read my 5 minutes worth. I'm happy to engage in this celebration of the founding of the Association for Mormon Letters, whose recognition of my early fiction was crucial to my further development as a fiction writer. I came from a literary family. My father, who taught high school English, accumulated a considerable opus of unpublished poems that remind me of the late Victorian English poets. As a child, I did a lot of daydreaming. Daydreams are unwritten short stories. Turning my daydreams into short stories seemed to come naturally to me. During my first year in high school, I received a copy of Bret Harte's selected short stories as a prize for winning Snowflake Union High School's Christmas story contest. I was 14. At the end of my senior year at BYU, I won a prize for a story based on an incident told me while I was a missionary in Belgium. I thought I would settle into writing fiction early in my academic career, but I didn't get around to trying my hand at it until I was in my 40s. In the mid-1970s, I acquired a copy of The Writer's Market and began submitting stories to magazines. After many submissions, The Confessions of Augustine found a publisher in the Denver Quarterly. My story, Road to Damascus, was published in Dialogue. At the end of 1978, the Association for Mormon Letters gave me its fiction prize for these stories. This recognition gave me a renewed impetus to master the craft of fiction. I submitted a collection of stories to the University of Illinois Press in 1980. The press accepted The Confessions of Augustine and Road to Damascus and asked me to revise or replace all the others. I now had to accept the fact that although I had successfully developed several good plots, I hadn't mastered the craft of fiction. I began to read John Barth's Lost in the Funhouse and Bernard Malamud's The Magic Barrel simply because they were handy. Quite immediately, I saw I could do what was being done in those stories. The important thing I saw was how they established a conflict in a character and then enlarged it through an advancing action. By May of 1980, I had begun to revise the story that would become the Shrive Prize and had started a new story, The Gift. At some point during the summer, I began a draft of The Christianizing of Coburn Heights. I continued to hone myself on the techniques of fiction, a topic on which I thought constantly. The consequence was that the University of Illinois Press published The Canyons of Grace, a collection of short stories which by the spring of 1983 had established a modest public presence. It was reviewed by a number of periodicals beyond Utah, including Publishers Weekly, the Los Angeles Examiner, and the Chicago Tribune. Within Utah, some bookstores were selling out and reordering, although, as I became aware, they didn't order large quantities. In my spare time thereafter, I went on with my endeavor to become a fiction writer, being already well into a draft of my novel, The Backslider. I will add that early during my mission, I realized that I could no longer believe in a deity who meted out rewards and punishments. I fulfilled my mission, but returned home with a sense of alienation from my many faithful friends and relatives. Fortunately, the recognition given my fiction by the Association for Mormon Letters allowed me for the first time in many years to feel again like an insider among the Mormons. Thank you.
Thank you, Levi. We will move on to Bruce.
Okay, I've been quoting Henry James a lot in the last few years. There is really too much to say. Um, and I want to talk a little bit about what Emerson called a long foreground. This was in his famous letter to Walt Whitman. And I'm thinking that, I guess I'm thinking a little bit along the lines of Mae Swenson's poem, How Everything Happens, in which she says, when nothing seems to be happening, something is stacking up to happen. And 1940s, things were stacking up from the 1940s on. Wallace Stegner's Mormon Country in 1942, writings by Dale Morgan and Ray B. West. Then into the 1950s, a very important essay, I think, by Bill Mulder in 1954 on Mormonism and literature, and the collection that he and A. Russell Mortensen edited of historical materials called Among the Mormons, which I think anticipated the kind of thing that Maureen Beecher had in mind when she summoned a bunch of us together. Then you get to the 60s. This is altogether too sketchy. You get BYU studies revitalized and the founding of dialogue. And then in 1974, Exponent 2 and Sunstone, and most importantly, really, the publication of Craycroft and Lambert's anthology of Believing People. I back up a little bit into the 1960s. My first professional publication in 1969 was an invited review of three books of poetry by Mormon poets that blew up into a rather long essay. I seem to do that every time I'm asked to review something, and I've tried to swear off reviewing, and it doesn't work. Anyway, in 1974, winter 1974 dialogue, there was a roundtable. Essays by Gene England, Carl Keller, and me, which I think sort of began to pull things into a kind of focus, so that when Maureen sent her invitation, we were sort of prepared for it. A lot of people had been thinking about it. I recall that sometime before 1976, I had written in a letter, I think to Bob Reese, that we ought really to get us Mormon literati together somehow, sometime, somewhere. So when Maureen's invitation came, that was an occasion. And I was there at that initial meeting in April of 1976. I wonder, and this is a question that Andrew might be able to address, the prospectus that he quotes in, I think it's note number 4 to his article on Spencer W. Kimball and the founding of AML. That prospectus reads to me like something Maureen might have written right after the meeting. But at any rate, if anyone skimming through that prospectus will just see all kinds of things that feed into the what should we call it? The definition, the character of AML. I didn't try to time myself. I just wrote notes. But I wanted to mention I was awards chair for quite a number of years. And I generally tried not to involve myself in judging and usually tried to select a judge whose taste and literary discernment I respected. And then that judge might or might not, depending on how much there was to read, I think partly, might convene a sort of committee. And sometimes I wrote or helped to write the citations. I nearly always did a little final editing on them before I read them at awards luncheons. Um, I don't know when it was that we adopted the phrase the AML presents an award in X, Y, or Z. But in my mind, that was a way of saying we don't necessarily claim that this is the absolute Platonic best Mormon poem or Mormon novel or whatever of the previous year, but it deserves recognition and exercise this. The possibility of multiple awards in a given category. I'm getting the message that my internet connection is unstable. We did fairly soon, I think, begin to multiply categories, which I think was well within the spirit of Maureen's prospectus and within the spirit of the phrase "for Mormon letters." As anyone might know who read Andrew's historical work, the initial invitation, as I recall it, was to talk about editing and, if possible, publishing Mormon letters and diaries, historical materials, which was one of Maureen's primary interests, though her degrees are in English and comparative lit, as I recall. I remember, I'm going to do a little anecdotage here, and you can tell me to stop if it seems to be irrelevant. At least once in 1987, I urged a belated award to a book in a category that we hadn't used before, as I recall, religious literature, a book that we'd overlooked in the previous year, 1986. This was Dennis Rasmussen's The Lord's Question. And I think the thing we tried to do, which wasn't always easy to do, how do you know what's being published if you don't know where to look? And so we had a lot of word of mouth and reviews here and there. And eventually someone, I think, began to sort of pay attention and list things, but I can't tell you much about that. But whenever something praiseworthy or a good report came to our attention, then we might create a nonce category to recognize it. And I think some of those nonce categories would become recurrent, if not more or less permanent. I think we gave an award for sermons at one point, though that may not have been the name of the category. In 1987, we gave an award in the novel to Levi's Backslider, and that got me into a little bit of trouble that I've recounted in a 2005 Sunstone panel, and was published in Sunstone the next year. I read the citation, and I was careful before I read all the citations to say that I had not written them, but that I had exercised a little bit of editorial discretion on some of them. Well, after the award luncheon, someone from Signature stepped up and asked me if they could quote the citation for Levi's novel in some advertising. And I said, yes. Just remember, I didn't write it. And I don't know who wrote it. The judges have always, at least in my memory, been anonymous. And that anonymity has been pretty carefully guarded as far as I know. I never knew. I knew the judge I'd selected, of course, but she convened a committee, and I had a hunch as to one member of that committee, but how large it was, who was on it, I had no idea. So I didn't know who'd written the citation. Well, when they published it, they attributed it to me, and it included the phrase, a hell of a good read, which was the truth, and which I certainly agreed with, and on rereading, still agree with. But as soon as I saw it, I called Signature and said, I thought I told you that I didn't write that. I wish you hadn't attributed it to me. And they apologized, and I thought that was the end of it. But then I got a phone call a day or so later from Jeff Holland, who was the president of BYU at the time, about it. And I explained what had happened. And he said, did I think that there should be some sort of public retraction? And I said, no, just make it a bigger deal than it already is. And as far as I know, that's the end of that story. That's one little bit of an inside story, but it's public already. In 1989, I think it was, we gave an award in the novel to Anne Edwards Cannon's young adult novel, Cal Cameron by Day, Spider-Man by Night. And I had read, I think, all the novels published that year. There weren't a huge number of them. That was certainly the best. That, I think, did raise Steve Sondrup's eyebrows a bit. And maybe that was a step on a slippery slope toward larger and larger inclusiveness. But I don't think that's been an entirely bad thing. One last small anecdote. I think 1989 was also the year that we gave Wayne Booth an award in criticism for The Company We Keep. And I had the duty of calling Wayne to notify him. And I think this was the first time that I had ever spoken to him. Well, the call turned out to be a real pleasure and the start of a kind of intermittent long distance friendship later on via email, which was all too short, as it turned out. But after I'd told him about the award and congratulated him, and he said, well, when people ask me where I got the values that I talk about in that book, and I think in other books, he said, I answer them like a good Aristotelian. I got them at home, growing up in Mormon country. So I think that's a story I can tell you. I mean, anyone who's read the Nicomachean Ethics will know what Wayne meant by replying as a good Aristotelian. That you get your basic values where you grow up, and if you're not brought up right, that's what Finn says of a fellow that don't get started right ain't got no show. That's really about all I have to say, and that's probably more than 5 minutes worth.
Uh,
I
thank
mean,
you,
I can
Bruce.
think of other
That
things.
was great. Well, you know what, you were one of the ones here from the beginning, and you've covered some of the things from the 1980s really well. So thank you. We are going to move on to John Benyon to
Well,
talk to us a little bit more.
can we have maybe some questions about that period
Oh,
first?
yeah, yeah. Actually, let's do that. While we've got Bruce and Levi, we're thinking about that time period. Let's do questions about this time period first.
Now, Levi, we heard about your work, but now you were president of AML twice in the 1980s. Do you remember what being president was like? Was there what were the conferences? Where were they held, and were they well attended in those days?
It was like herding cats. Oh, I don't, I'm an old, feeble man, and I got a diminished memory. What did we do? Uh, you folks know better than I. For me, the AML introduced me to a lot of bright personalities, and I formed writing group with Dennis Clark and Bruce and John Benyon and eventually Gene England, and that writing group gave me a lot of impetus toward continuing to write stories and so on. But I'm interested in hearing these 5-minute announcements, the summaries of each person here.
Okay.
Yeah.
John, you're muted. Are you saying something?
Okay. I wonder if before we moved on that we might talk about the contribution of Stephen Sondra because he was like Secretary Treasurer for 2 decades essentially, or on the board. And Bruce and Levi, what do you note about his long contribution?
Well, I can't remember too much other than the pleasant times we spent at his home. Uh, I think he objected somehow. I can't remember why the award to Ann Cannon. Does anyone else remember that?
Well, I was saying I I recall that award raised his eyebrows,
Now, why?
objected.
Why though? Why did it? What was the
I
problem?
don't know. He may have felt that it simply wasn't capital L literature.
I thought it
It
was good stuff. I
it
liked
was
it.
You
So,
know, one thing, while we're talking about Stephen Sondrup, I just want to note his ongoing influence. He was the editor of the Arts and Inspiration sort of criticism
Mhm.
reader, that's very wide in what it draws on. It was a wonderful discovery for me, obviously much later, to find that and find that not only had he solicited contributions from people in sort of the Utah academic community and spread around the US. But there's a piece from Johann Vondra, who was a Latter-day Saint, who was director of the State Opera in Austria, in Vienna. Um, and so, yeah, I'm definitely glad for the work that Stephen did in building community and then capturing and documenting sort of a slice of that. It's also interesting that that's a collection that has a piece from Boyd K. Packer alongside these other literary and artistic figures. And so, really wide range of thinking about how things went for the community. And from the perspective of later generations, the work that you guys did to show different strains of what the literature could do and be, but also have those first conversations about what are the terms in which we consider it, have been really valuable. It's nice to have built on that legacy. So John, thanks for the question.
Um, I would just say that Stephen was sort of always behind the scenes of almost everything that happened. I try to remember, did he sort of keep us in touch with one another? We did hold, as I recall, board meetings at his home. Uh, I hope I'm remembering that correctly.
Yeah.
Um, I remember that in one year, and I think it was during John Tanner's presidency. I think he was president for a couple of years, and I'm sorry I don't remember the year. This may have been in the 80s, must have been in the 80s. Membership had dwindled. I'm not sure why, uh, but I think we held the awards meeting in Stephen's home. Uh, it had gotten so small there for a point. I don't know why membership fluctuated the way it did at that time or at some later times. Margaret will probably have some things to say about later times when membership dwindled. We've just never been anything like the Mormon History Association for perpetuity and overall size. Dues were always modest. I was a little bit amused when I was made an honorary member, an honorary lifetime member, because I'd always been a lifetime member. So the honorary designation was sort of funny, but
Are you sure it was honorary or was it just ornery?
well, it could have
I'm
been.
just
It could have
sorry.
been. I'm not really known for my
No,
cantankerous.
you're not ornery either. Sorry.
I wonder if
So,
the
so,
oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
oh, sorry. I was going to just say before we move on from this time period, also, it seems like a lot of people involved in the 80s were at BYU or, kind of around BYU involved. And I know Bruce mentioned a little bit of a phone call one time from the BYU president, but what kind of was the relationship institutionally with AML and places like BYU or UVSC? I know Eugene England ended up going to UVSC later, but was it a comfortable fit? Was BYU happy you were doing this, or was it a little bit don't don't rock the boat kind of thing? I'm not sure how to describe it.
Well,
What would you think?
well, everyone interested in that question really has to read Andrew's article on Spencer W. Kimball and the founding of AML. I didn't know that story, uh, so I guess from the side of the institutional church, from the side of the trustees and the administration, there was a certain amount of anxiety almost sounds too strong, but a concern. And someone was probably keeping an eye on us. Here's another anecdote for you. When we gave the award to Judith Freeman for her novel The Chinchilla Farm, I think it was The Chinchilla Farm. It might have been Family Attractions, but at any rate, her father had disapproved of the novel uh, rather strenuously, uh, and she let him know about the award from the Association for Mormon Letters. Well, I got a letter from Mr. Freeman um, asking if this meant some sort of church approval of his wayward daughter's novel. He didn't call her a wayward daughter. That's me. Um, and I wrote a very careful reply. I don't know where a copy of it is. Judith has one, I'm pretty sure, or had one. She does tell a little bit about this in her autobiography. Um, but I had to explain very carefully. Well, a lot of members and officers of AML are also BYU faculty member, but there is absolutely no official connection between AML and the church or BYU. BYU has generously hosted many of our conferences and has been supportive of our attendance at conferences as far as I could tell. But I think there's more to say about that. For one thing, BYU has never had a Mormon studies program. Gene started one at UVSC when he went there. Uh, Writing on Mormon subjects and publishing in Mormon venues like Dialogue and Sunstone, especially as you got into the 90s after the, was it 1990 statement on symposia? Then you felt a certain amount of heat and lack of reward if you published in one of those venues. I think that's fair to say, and I don't think it's any big secret. I can say about that much about it. But BYU is always quite generous as a host for our meetings when we had them there. I remember a luncheon in the Sky Room of the Wilkinson Center where Dick Cummings gave an address to which Gene England replied the following year, and so on and so forth.
I think Gideon has something to say or ask.
Yeah, I might comment a little bit more on the BOU connections, or John Benyon might, but and I think that's kind of there was a dynamic. It changed and developed over time. But if we're still talking about the earliest period and influential people, Stephen Sondrup was mentioned. I'm so glad that he was, but really core was Lavina Fielding Anderson, and she was the one who kept the proceedings well edited. I just ran across some old files where I had some correspondence with Lavina, and she was just so generous as a great editor and thoughtful about what we were trying to do. And she She preserved the core stuff from the early years with the proceedings, and completely invaluable. Levina.
I'm glad
That's right.
we got to honor her few years before she passed at an AML meeting at BYU. I thought that was great that we got to honor her there.
Just before we move
Yeah.
on, it should be meant, well, I think it's important to mention the influence of Weber State, which happened because of Levi being there, but also the Caesaris were involved in the organization for a while. So it wasn't only BYU, it was also Weber State.
And we kind of mentioned Gene England briefly, but I get the impression that Gene England was kind of, he kind of wrote these articles that set the tone of what is Mormon literature and what should we be studying. Was he like in the organization itself also a central person, or was he more of just kind of giving the ideas?
He, it, we're not talking about the later areas, so I don't know about the earlier ones, but during my time, he was not really involved much that I remember.
Okay.
Well, he was president for at least 1 year.
Mhm.
At least my recollection is that his presidency followed that of Richard Cummings.
That's right.
I might be mistaken on that,
Oh, that's right.
but I'm trying to remember which of Gene's essays was actually his presidential address, and I can't call the title of that essay to mind, but it was in response to Richard Cummings. So he was always very much involved and taught Mormon Lit, LDS Lit, the course that Dick Craycroft and Neil Lambert had originated and constructed their anthology for.
Okay,
Yeah.
Jesse, so we move to
Go
the
ahead.
next period.
Okay. Yeah, that is great. It's important to remember people that we can remember that were involved during that time period. I think we'll move on to John and start moving into the 1990s and what came next.
I was on the board during the that most of that decade and a president at the end of that time. So I note four significant things that happened during those years. First, Chris Bigelow started Iriantum, and I really wanted all through since then to somehow take credit for that, but I don't think I can. Uh, Chris, you at that time and still are a genius at figuring out how to start a journal. And it took the place of the not just the list, but the newsletter and the proceedings. It expanded those other things into something that really was important for a lot of decades. The second thing is that at the start of the decade, the founding members were still involved, and by the end, they had kind of turned it over to a new generation. That's a slight oversimplification, but that's kind of what happened during the decade. And then the third thing is we started thinking of Mormon literature as being interesting not to only literary scholars, but to readers, bookstore managers, and others also interested in popular literature. And so that Stephen Sondrup would have frowned even more had he been intimately involved during those years, because a lot of it was not what he might have considered serious literature. But that was another thing that happened. I think the most important thing that happened was that during that decade was that AML stopped being BYU centric. And I think this is an essential shift. Others have talked about the link between the BYU and the AML and the growth of Mormon literature. And I think those three elements are integrated, but less so after the end of that decade. Of the 19 presidents before me, 12 were associated with BYU Provo. And of the 18 presidents who come after me, I think I'm kind of in the center of time in this scenario. No. But the ones who came after me, there are four, maybe five, who are associated with BYU Provo, and then two more with either Hawaii or Idaho. And I think why and how this happened, that these three things, three institutions are related, is as significant to look into. In the early 2020s, Michael Austin and I had a conversation on a Google Doc. We just wrote back and forth to each other, and we edited that and later published it in BYU Studies in 2021, called Mapping Futures, the Dialogue on Mormon Literary Studies. And Michael's quite interested in the building of a Mormon literary tradition that is a subcategory of American literature. And I'm going to repeat a few things we talked about there because the history of the AML and the history of Mormon lit and BYU are so closely linked, as I just said. Michael wrote the first stage in creating a literary tradition is usually some kind of manifesto in which writers and critics boldly declare that X literature exists and deserves a place at the grown-ups table. I'm not going to go into each of these in the same depth, but some of them more than others, the three stages. The next stage is usually canon building, Michael said. He mentions Gene England, Richard Craycoff, Ed Geary, Neil Lambert, who studied and brought into establish the importance of Vardis Fisher, Virginia Sorensen, Maureen Whipple, and others, establish them as Mormon writers. Quote, Michael, but that work came to a screeching halt when the first generations of critics retired, and it is just now starting back up. I'm going to move to the third stage, which I want to spend more time on than the other two. The third stage in the process is the creation of institutions, journals, presses, endowed chairs, contests, grants, graduate seminars, and so on. Once again, the institution building for Mormon literature happened in the 60s and 70s. And he mentioned Dialogue, Sunstone, the Association of Mormon Letters. He says, this is also when started teaching Mormon literature classes and published the first anthology of Mormon literature. He writes, those institutions have been vital, but they are now 50 years old and struggling to remain relevant in a world transformed by technology. And then he talks about the Motley Vision website, the Mormon Lit Blitz, and Peculiar Pages imprint, Zareham Books, Chris again, the AML website, Dawning of a Brighter Day, and it gives a lot of credit to Andrew for keeping the AML alive. And he writes that institutions like these will carry Mormon literature into the future. For the same essay, I wrote about what happened at BYU during the time I was in the board, and I think it's pertinent because it shows why there was this split between BYU and the AML and BYU and Mormon literature, it doesn't explain everything, but it talks about some of it. So I wrote in this article, during the 90s, the English department at BYU experienced an intense version of the natural culture wars that English departments across the country passed through. In the English department history, written by Doug Taylor, he states that many progressive faculty embraced gender studies, new historicism, multicultural studies, and post-colonial studies, and other isms, but some traditional faculty were less enthusiastic about them, arguing that criticism had become more important than literature, the literature useful only as a means to discuss criticism. Now, not long after I came to the department in 1989, faculty meetings became battlefields. That's not an overstatement. Thayer writes, a political polarity between liberals and conservatives had developed, focusing on feminism, abortion versus pro-life, and cultural studies. The national press and the American Association of University Professors had become involved in airing departmental problems. Even BYU's accrediting associations began to raise questions about department issues. Through correspondence, general authorities told Lambert to solve the department's glaring problems. Several faculty members didn't receive continuing status, were forced to leave, or left because they felt unable to be themselves. These faculty members were replaced by young scholars who might gain national reputations and wouldn't focus on Mormon literary studies. Thayer writes that Lambert worked to emphasize scholarship by hiring only the most promising new faculty, particularly women, at equal salaries with men. C.J. Fox, who became chair after Lambert, continued the drive to hire new faculty, who had already published in significant journals as doctoral students and who had a trajectory toward building a career through nationally significant scholarship. Thayer writes, moving toward more scholarly specialization during the previous 20 years, most faculty had begun routinely presenting papers at scholarly conferences, publishing articles and creative works in journals, and authoring an increased number of books published by scholarly presses. Today, faculty publish in major university presses and first-tier journals, but few publish critical articles in Mormon literary studies. And so I think this split between BYU and Mormon literary studies, in part due to the culture wars, produced a desire on the part of the English department and the general authorities to not have a cultural studies institution at BYU. And that was not that displeasure with cultural studies didn't start during that decade or it didn't end after it. But that's when it started. And I think that was a significant period in the history of the AML. And that's basically what I wanted to describe, that historical movement.
Thanks. That's really helpful. I was a student in the English department in the late 90s and early 2000s. And as a student, I think I might have missed some of that because when you're young, you don't always know what's going on.
You could, you couldn't hear the
But
shouting.
I could hear the
I
shouting
am,
a decade later, John.
You can still hear the shouting if you listen closely.
yes. Now I work here and I can see some things. Okay. We are going to move on to Chris Bigelow. He was as John mentioned, creator, founder of Ariantum. And so he's going to tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, so to kind of get into this, I'll let you know what my gateway drug was to Mormon literature. I was in college and I was on the East Coast and I was reading the New Yorker magazine, and there was a review of a book by a writer named Walter Kern. And the stories in the book, some of them were actually about Mormon people as humans. Walter Kern had been a Latter-day Saint in his youth, and so he had some insider info and he used it. And I was like, can you even do that? I mean, my mind was blown that you could write about Mormons in such a way. So then I came to BYU, and I went bought season tickets to the play, to the theater department, and I saw Eric Samuelson's Accommodations. And that was as mind-blowing to me because it was like, wait a minute, you can write about Mormons as human and you're a Mormon from inside? So it was one thing for Walter Kern to be an outsider doing it, but Eric Samuelson really blew my mind about a different kind of Mormon literature. And then I had the very, very good fortune of taking Eugene England's Mormon literature class as part of my master's degree. And I got the whole basis in Craycroft Jorgensen criticism debates that were going on, and with others as well, and Whipple and Sorensen and that basis. But then I also got introduced to newer people, and really importantly, Eugene England introduced us to the AML as students and invited us to get involved. And I was really intrigued, and I attended a AML conference, and Benson Parkinson actually spoke. He's the guy that put together AML List, which I really, really missed. That was fun. AML List was fun. It was just an email-based discussion, but Benson Parkinson had a way of running that in such an organized, careful, and yet creative way. And that's sort of where I got enough energy worked up to where I wanted to be involved with the AML. And so I think what I was trying to do was, and I worked with Benson on this, we worked together, is sort of put the lightning of AML List in a can that we could publish on paper And a lot of Erie Anthem, the literary journal that Benson and I started, really drew heavily on AML list. We often ran articles and stories on there before we chose it for the magazine, for the literary magazine, and a lot of the debates. We even had AML list excerpts. We would pick out particularly cogent discussions that had taken place on the email group, and we would publish them in the magazine, partly because we didn't want them to be lost. We thought maybe if they were on paper, that would help them survive. So I feel like I came into the AML at a good juncture. There would have been a wonderful foundation established, and Mormon literature was worth taking. The AML had already shown that Mormon literature was worth taking seriously. The founders and the early leaders created a place where Mormon writing could be discussed and critiqued and celebrated and debated and awarded and remembered. And they created a sense that the Mormon experience could sustain literature and serious literary criticism. So I came into this and it was wonderful. And so Erie Adams started in 1999. Benson and I did it with the help of the AML. We were very much an AML house organ attending. We were embedded with them financially and attended all of the meetings and had a lot of help and support from the board of AML. We built on the print newsletter that the AML had been putting out. We've started out thinking of ourselves as an expansion of that. I think Levi, you might have been the newsletter editor at that time. But we wanted a literary magazine that could serve as more of a gathering place, a more regular gathering place for full-length fiction and poetry and essays and reviews and criticism and conversation all in one place that came out on a regular schedule and that felt like an ongoing dialogue, and that hopefully we could spread around to more audiences. And the name of the magazine, Erie Anthem, you probably recognize as a Book of Mormon term that means many waters. And Benson and I chose that because it was really a guiding principle of ours that we really wanted the magazine to be broad enough to include all different kinds of voices and approaches that had something to do with Mormonism in a literary sense. We might have Dean Hughes, a successful Deseret Book historical fiction author, on our cover and featured 1 month or 1 quarter, I suppose. And then we might have Brian Evanson the next year or the next quarter, who was in fact, I was in the Eugene England's literary Mormon literature class. I was sitting in there when Brian Evanson came through and did his teaching. He taught the course that night as part of his application to come to BYU. So he was another part of my imagination about what Mormon literature could be. He's kind of a horror writer. But anyway, we might put him on the cover the next quarter. And we put Richard Dutcher on there, and we put Anita Stansfield, a very orthodox is maybe not the right word, but a Deseret Book or Covenant Book published romance author. We wanted a bit of everybody. We really didn't want to be identified as either liberal or conservative as a publication. I remember talking about trying to occupy a temperate zone of Mormon literature. We didn't want to be at the poles, the cold poles, or we didn't want to just be at the equator where it was too hot. We wanted to be able to reach both of those areas and everything in between. We wanted to give respectful attention to writers and literature, whether they were Orthodox or culturally liberal, if they were national market writers that were either Mormon, writing in a national market, or an outsider writing about Mormonism in a national market. Inactive Mormon writers, post-Mormons, um, currently active Mormons. It didn't matter to us. Even non-Mormon writers who were like Tony Kushner was actually in touch with us, and I don't think we ever did an interview with him, but we wanted everybody. We wanted everything. Maybe it was too much. I mean, that breadth was not always easy to maintain, and it may have been jarring and off-putting at times, causing whiplash for some readers. But I thought it was overall good for us to take that approach. My own hope was I was really interested in the Walter Kern approach of having Mormon themes and stories that could resonate beyond our own community. That's what really turned me on. And I was hoping that Iriantum, I would send copies to literary agents and publishers that were outside of Mormonism, hoping they might even look into Iriantum to get ideas for Mormon related authors that they could develop. I don't know that that ever happened, but that was part of the mindset. Benson, on the other hand, he was very interested in creating a more of a middle ground in, I would say, inside Mormon culture, literary sensibility that it wouldn't be Deseret Book where there was a little too much of perhaps a proselyting agenda going on with a lot of the fiction, and he wasn't as interested in sort of the disaffected stuff. He wanted realistic, um, human, and yet fully in touch with faith and theology. And I think that was what he helped bring to the magazine. And I think that stuck and that guided us a lot. And I was a little sad that wasn't able to stick with, I can't remember why, but he didn't stay with Ariantum in the AML for too long. I think he went into full-time church headquarters employment or something. Anyway, so I just wanted to say that my favorite part of doing Iriantum, I did it for about 5 years, was the author interviews that we put on the cover. Overall, those are my favorite things to be involved with, my favorite contribution to the whole thing. I liked hearing all those authors wrestle with the bigger questions. What makes literature Mormon? Who is the intended audience? How explicitly should faith even appear in fiction? Should literature strengthen belief or challenge belief or complicate belief, or should it just simply tell the truth as the author sees it? Different writers in these interviews answered these questions very differently. Some embraced themselves as Mormon writers, and others didn't want that label. Some people saw literature as a vehicle for testimony. Others saw it as a way of exploring uncertainty and contradiction. But this was you could almost, as more of the cover interviews were published, you could feel the writers responding to each other, and not just from other Iriantum interviews, but other sources of conversation and debate. They bubbled up into these interviews, and that was really, I thought, very interesting. So overall, these conversations and Iriantum itself, they revealed that Mormon literature really isn't a settled category, but it's a living argument among thoughtful people who care deeply about faith and craft and culture, audience, and truth. And it does remind me of Eugene England's ideas of proving contraries. I think AML and Iriantum and all the other venues we've had, it has often functioned as a place where the contraries can be tested: faith and doubt, devotion and criticism, popular versus literary, insider versus outsider perspectives. We didn't want to eliminate those tensions, but to try to engage them productively. And so when I look back on AML's history and whatever part Iriantum played in that, I do think I think our biggest achievement is that we didn't, not that we produced a single unified literary movement, but that we created a space where the conversation happened and can continue. Um, I think we've been asking important questions through the AML. Um, what does the Mormon experience make possible in literature? What stories emerge from this theology, this culture, and this history, and these contradictions, and what can these stories contribute not only to Mormon readers but to literature more broadly? And I think our work has seen it's come to its peak in the recent television shows on Hulu and other places. Isn't that what we've been working for? The secret lives of Mormon wives and housewives of Salt Lake City and all the rest of it.
I think we need Secret Lives of Mormon Authors. Everybody will be so bored that
Well, Chris, you added to the collection of those conversations, didn't you?
We did collect them in one book. Is that what you mean?
Yeah,
Yeah, it was called Conversations with Mormon Authors. And
right,
I don't
right.
really know nothing to it, but yeah, that
Very useful collection.
yeah, I love that collection. So anyway, that's my Erie Anthem story. I'm glad it could play a small role in the bigger effort, and I wish I were more in touch with the AML nowadays. But it sure is a pleasure to be involved with the 50-year retrospective. So thank you.
thank you, Chris. We're going to go on to Gideon Burton. He's going to talk to us a little bit more about kind of the same time period, early 90s, or sorry, late 90s, early 2000s, and his involvement with AML, what the organization was like during that time period.
Thanks. This brings back a lot of memories and a lot of joy and so much appreciation, Chris, what you did with Ariantum. It just breathed new life into AML. I was so amazed at what you were able to do to kind of extend the mission of AML more broadly, and so much volunteer work. You remember those? Where were we once in the basement of Marilyn Brown's theater in Springville on Main Street there? Packing up copies of Iriantum with cherry silver to send out. There's some real grunt work involved in, getting these staple bound, inexpensive little pieces of literary joy out to the world. You did some real legwork on that, and I don't want that to go unnoticed. And John, you're the one that got me involved in AML on the board and leadership, and I really appreciate that. And Bruce, I was just amazed at what you wrote, and then I was bemused at how you and Richard Craycroft would go after each other. I mean, during my years is where, or maybe just before, you would have these warring presidential addresses from one year to the next. It was kind of a tradition, wasn't it, Bruce? And so
I don't
Bruce would. Bruce, I think he made this grand argument of, as literature as hospitality, and just really worked that motif. Love that. Let the stranger say, wasn't that it? And
Yes.
then Richard Craycroft comes back and wants to talk about attuning the authentic Mormon voice, and so we had these polls. I don't know if we remained in the temperate zone all the time, Chris, but I think we were swinging back enough to feel the weather. Um, there are some. I also wanted to do a shout out for the AML list, and I wanted to maybe refer to it not just as an on-ramp for Iriantum, but I think there was this transition in the organization that happened starting in the mid 90s and into the early 2000s, which came with the internet. I started my career at BYU in 1994, and that's when they very first had internet at BYU, and students didn't even have email addresses at that time. And an AML list was chugging away strong in the early days of the internet, and it developed quite a community there that was just so completely to one side of anything going on in academia. And it pioneered that digital space in a way that was pretty significant. And you mentioned Benson Parkinson. I also just wanted to remember a few others that were really prominent there, like Scott Parkin. Scott was always chiming in at really interesting points of view on science fiction. Kent Larson, and who else? Michael Austin. Um, there were a lot of voices that built a real sense of community, and some of that was just independent to AMLS, but of course it helped to buoy the general organization.
Jonathan Langford.
I Go ahead.
Just wanted to make sure Jonathan Langford's name was also
Oh,
included.
absolutely, Jonathan. Yeah, we miss
Pauline
Jonathan.
Mortensen, I think, wrote some really good posts.
Yeah, yeah, and may I just point out that um, John, you made sure that the BOU archives got copies of the whole AML email, the AML list, the discussion board. I remember you made that happen as well as the paper proceedings and so on, and I really appreciate that. And I felt kind of some of that burden and obligation to try to help solidify some of the presence of Mormon literature. And so, and this was tied into my own academic career. It was not easy to work on Mormon literature. John knows this from being a fiction writer at BYU. I was more playing a critic and a literary scholar working with bibliography. And that, you just didn't get credit for things that you did with things that were Mormon. And so it was tough. I really didn't work on it until I had tenure. Um, but then I do want to acknowledge that the BYU had this sort of duality to it because it also allowed me enormous freedom to create the Mormon literature database, which became the Mormon Literature and Creative Arts database. And that was something that was, I just took a bibliography that Gene England had started with. He'd started working um, with Larry Draper and Connie Lamb and Robert Means over at the BYU library. And so I continued working with them, and then we took this paper bibliography that they'd started with, and I helped to design the database. And later on, they got some money and redesigned the database, and we expanded it from just being the Mormon Literature database to being the Mormon Literature and Creative Arts database. We were pretty ambitious. We were trying to make it be a database for all the Mormon arts, and we put a lot of films in there and so on. And I would marshal some of my students to do projects to work on expanding the database. But those projects are huge, and I don't know. I think we barely scratched the surface, but at least we started to establish some categories and genres, and doing some of that spade work that John, when you mentioned what Michael Austin had said, that things that help to establish a field, we got a good running start on it there. We were doing this before there was any kind of Mormon studies program, not just at BYU, but really anywhere. That would happen a little bit later on. And so, it was all very volunteer. It was an act of love because no one was making money off of this. No one was getting academic credit for it. And I think that's part of the real character of AML is that you had people that were doing it for love, right, Andrew? I mean, I don't know if you got your last check, but you know, cash it quick if you did. Um, and I think that is really the spirit of AML is people are there because they love literature, they love the arts, they have a love of Mormonism that ranges across a spectrum of participation and so on. Oh, Levi, I have to make a call out to you as well. I mean, when Gene England had me read Your Canyons of Grace, it completely blew my mind. And like, am I allowed to read this at BYU? And but then in turn, when I became a professor at BYU, I remember signing your backslider, and there's a student in the class who was he was on the seminary teacher track, and he found some things to object to within the backslider. And he stated it in this just nasty, awful way. And I said, I'm really sorry that you're offended, but and then I was trying to channel Jane England, and let's make sure that our conversation is peaceful, even if we may disagree about things. You stirred the pot, Levi, and we admire you for that, and broke some new ground. Um, Anyway, I wanted to just point out that at this period in AML, just at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, that's when the online presence started to be something really significant. And of course, that would graduate into other things like the Bloggernacle, which was not quite in existence when I was president of AML and became a real important thing. You had other outgrowths of AML that if they weren't directly some of the personnel from AML, I know that, for example, Ben Crowder and Catherine Morris started the Mormon Artist magazine. That was a great contribution, lots of great interviews with people there. I also wanted to say that this was a period of time in which Mormon literature started to interface with other parts of the Mormon arts that were flourishing. I already mentioned that the Mormon Literature Database graduated to become the Mormon Literature and Creative Arts Database, but you have the rise of Mormon film really happening, right? The whole Richard Dutcher moment, and around 2003, 2005, when things really started to explode with Mormon films in theaters. Um, and that became a real important thing. Later on, when I was an editor at BYU Studies, and I worked with Randy Astle, who created the wonderful history of Mormon film. He created these periods of Mormon film that he used the map of those periods that Gene England had supplied in his Mormon Literature Progress and Prospects piece that mapped out Mormon literature. That became this template for Randy to help make sense of Mormon film, which followed a similar but also a different trajectory. And so we talked about first wave, second wave, third wave of Mormon film. And so I think that the success of things like the LDS Film Festival was partly to do with that we were pretty liberal with things within the Mormon literature zone. We weren't afraid to talk about film, as Chris mentioned, with talking about directors in Orientum. Does anyone remember when we started to give awards in film? Or I don't know if that's continued, but are there ongoing awards in non-literary genres?
Yes, yes, we're still doing film and drama, and yeah, building on that from that period.
That's great. I do think that the awards were an interesting aspect of this as we tried to figure out which awards we should start thinking more about. I'm glad to see that AML took this further after I was involved in the leadership. Oh, I wanted to mention that the the conferences that we started having some thematic conferences. I remember we had one, Beauty and Belief. We had another one that was wrestling with the word. And then for a time, and you'll have to tell me, I don't know if it continued, but we started this writers conference that was kind of a parallel thing. Is that ongoing, Andrew or James? But anyway, that was
No, that was a short period. I actually never made it to one of those. I think that was just before I got involved with Mormon
oh,
literature, but I heard the lore.
what we had there is we had, obviously people that were aspiring authors, but we also had published authors coming, self-published authors coming, talking about how they did it. Um, and that was good to kind of open us up to different ways, not just like realizing your literary dreams, but connecting with other aspects of the literary religious world. For example, Kenny Kemp, who was writing for Harper San Francisco, which is a religious imprint for Harper, and he showed that you could do these stories about Jesus that would reach a national audience, and we're like, what? And so we started thinking about things like the Christian Booksellers Association, which was, gigantic. And so we kind of looked at some of the things that were going on in the Christian publishing world, and that gave us things to think about in the LDS world. Meanwhile, you have things kind of shifting within Mormon culture because, I mean, a lot of Mormon literature came about because in the last quarter of the 20th century and forward came about because of Desert Book and Bookcraft starting to publish more literary kinds of genres. And so Carolyn Pearson proved that you could actually make money with poetry. Who'd have thought? And you had others, there started to be money to be made within the Mormon market. And where AML sort of both got it and didn't get it was in the areas of like young adult and romance. Now, Chris mentioned that Ariantum did feature some of those authors and titles, but there's a different crowd that started to really both consume and generate popular Mormon fiction. And so you had a different group around the Storytellers Conference and then the Whitney Awards. And I don't know if there's ever been any kind of effort to connect between these groups because they really started kind of evolving in different directions. So I just want to mention that because AML sometimes was maybe it kept its roots with those who were institutionally involved with a university. I'm glad we mentioned it was more than just BYU, but there really were academics that were at the core of this from the start. And that's maybe both a blessing and a curse for AML. And what I think began to solve that, and maybe James will talk about this, is that you had enough of a critical mass of things happening outside of academia, outside of BYU, and chiefly online, that AML could have a life on its own without academics. And I'm personally am glad to see that it isn't just you know uh, male BYU professors that are involved with AML anymore. I just wanted to also mention that Gene England, we were asking what role he played in the organization. I think he was kind of the, what do we want to call him? High priest, godfather, patriarch, benign influence that always was just kind of there. And he kept doing steadily these works that just shored up the foundation of Mormon literature. Remember, he did these anthologies of Mormon poetry with Dennis Clark. He did a Mormon Tending the Garden, Fire in the Pasture, Harvest. These anthologies that really help to memorialize Mormon literature and keep it going and give us something to talk about at conferences. It was really sad what happened to Gene, but of course he, both his being dismissed from BYU and his dying far too early. But he always made good on where he went, and he helped Mormon literature to grow even more down the street in Orem, and started things happening there that couldn't happen at BYU. So thank you, Gene. I also wanted to just mention that we did that special memorial issue of Gene England when he passed. And that was a time when Chris, wasn't it? We went to a little higher level of production with Iriantum at that time, and it was really a very attractive memorial issue that happened.
Color. We used color.
Yeah, that was nice. I just wanted to say that it's just kind of this amazing nexus of people that somehow cross paths, and I'm so glad that it has started to vary and change over time. And I'm also really glad that we haven't forgotten our roots, because there are really some wonderful people and authors that have been discovered and rediscovered by way of this organization. So thanks.
All right. Thank you, Gideon. I did get an email with some thoughts from Margaret Young, uh, who wasn't able to actually join. She said that Eric Samuelson had been president. Margaret wrote that Eric had done his job well, but we were kind of losing board members. So that would be right around the kind of 2010s, late 2009. Margaret noted that she did put on a conference at BYU. She was teaching LDS Lit at BYU and had a lot of her students involved with that conference. Or not at BYU, sorry, UVU. I do remember that. I believe that was in 2011, if I'm remembering correctly. I do remember attending that conference at UVU. And then in 2016, I believe Joe Plicka took over and they had a conference in Hawaii, which I was not able to attend, but I do remember that. One other thing I did want to mention about kind of the early 2000s, that first decade or so, the 2000s that we're talking about. Another person who and maybe it's just from my personal experience, but I feel like it was important, but not now always an official member of AML, was Chris Crow at BYU, who did young adult literature, but his young adult literature classes often included many LDS authors. Chris is an author himself as well. He and Ann Cannon and Carol Lynch Williams were really involved in running the Writing for Young Readers Conference every year. So even if they were not explicitly doing Mormon literature, they were really foundational, I think, in especially that kind of the young adult and children's literature for that were Mormon authors, and sometimes Mormon themes, sometimes not. But I think Chris really played an important role in Mormon literature, even if not directly in the AML. But I know several of those authors. Oh my gosh, why am I forgetting? There's a picture book author who was also interviewed in Iriantum. I'm suddenly
Rick?
forgetting his
Rick
name.
Rick
Rick
Walton.
Walton.
Yes, Rick Walton. So, and I mean, we could have a whole other 3-hour conversation about children's and young adult literature and Mormon literature, but at least from my experience in that time period, kind of 2000, late 90s to mid 2000s, I really think Chris Crow was influential there as well. And Gideon really mentioned kind of that flourishing of online spaces. I was also really involved with Segula for a long time, which had a print journal and then moved online. Exponent 2 also was another one where it had a print journal and then a blog. And sometimes there were a lot of people who would discover things through websites who might not even realize that they had an actual organization or a print component to them, that thinking, oh, well, this is just part of the Bloggernacle, and which is part of and adjacent to Mormon literature, but not always the starting point for it. Let's see. How are we doing on time? Do we have any other thoughts or questions for that time period, or do we want to move on to like
I think we better move on
2014?
because James has got it now.
We probably need to move on. So I think we'll move on to James, and we're going to start talking about the last 10 years or so.
All right. Well, um, I don't know. There's some contradictions to this more recent period because on the one hand, I feel like the looser association with academics and university spaces has made it so sometimes it felt like a struggle for the Association for Mormon Letters to survive and kind of keep operating. At the same time, there's been a lot going on for some of the reasons Gideon mentioned. Um, Having shared digital spaces made it easier for people to have conversations. And so there's a lot of conversation that sort of dipped in and out of the Association for Mormon Letters. The association itself was a significant gathering place and meeting place. Um, but yeah, there's sort of these overlapping things. So maybe to talk about the digital spaces first. Um, from 2013 to 2018, there wasn't an Iriantum magazine. The print run had finished, and then it was in 2018 when the digital revival began. And William Morris and Eric Jepson have been kind of the key editors on that, who have ended up making a really flourishing online magazine in part through a model where there are a lot of issues with a guest editor. So you could have a single person bring that passion that Gideon was talking about, and have a themed issue, and help gather people together. But then we haven't had the problem with long-term sustainability in the same way because the figures like Eric Jepson, who are serving longer terms, aren't putting in all the work on every issue. They're kind of they're able to focus on continuity rather than on production. And so Iriantum is one space that had a difficult transition from the print era into the digital era, but seems to have done very well in the digital era. Um, I was first involved with the Association for Mormon Letters in 2006 when the email listserv was still there. Obviously, there was a point with changing communication where they ended up retiring the listserv. Uh, for a while, the AML blog was really a very active center of conversation. It still exists to today, but like many blogs, a lot of the energy ended up moving onto social media and into spaces. Today, there's a very active AML Discord group where some of that same kind of chatter happens. And the blogs become maybe more news and reviews oriented. But yeah, in the early 2010s and maybe the late years of the first decade of the 21st century, there was a lot of energy in that blog. Um, there was a criticism blog called the Motley Vision that was a group blog that in the 2010s was very active. In terms of fiction production, the Mormon Liblets started from discussions on the AML blog and at AML conferences that Scott Hales and I had been talking about ideas about a lot of the negative preconceptions people had about Mormon literature that they associated it with, sort of the simple didactic. We wanted ways for people to have some experience with something, playing with rhetorical positioning in a different way, with literary tools in a different way. And so, out of a discussion on the AML blog, we created a contest that's lasted. So, from 2012 to now, we're in the 15th year of a regular flash fiction, essay, poetry contest. And then of course, online venues have greatly increased. I'd probably give a shout out to Wayfair magazine that I think in the last few years has done a good job of integrating some literary voices into a larger sort of Mormon intellectual community conversation. We did have a lot of fun at AML conferences in the 2010s. I remember one in 2015 where in addition to papers and panels, we had a handful of structured debates where some of those questions Chris was talking about that are sort of the persistent things that Latter-day Saint writers and readers talk about. We'd assign people to each side of the debate and they'd have a formal kind of Lincoln Douglas style back and forth. Um, I remember the 2018 conference, which was one of the first conferences we co-held with another organization. It was held in conjunction with the Mormon Scholars in the Humanities. Um, and I remember that in part because we honored Lavina Fielding Anderson at the awards ceremony that night. Her husband Paul was there, and I think it was the next day he passed away. And that
That night.
really reminded
It
me
was
that
that
like
night. It was
it
that
was
night.
that night,
They went home and then he passed away.
and he passed away that night. And so, it was nice that we could give them this summative moment together at the end of Paul's life and at the end of her experience of that marriage. And I think given that it can be sort of lonely to do literature in general and Mormon literature in particular, the community building aspect has been significant. Skipping ahead to 2022, I remember several of us attending the funeral for Bella Petsko together and being, a significant contingent of the people at that funeral, that he was remembered for his literary work, and that was a way he'd sort of continued to speak to the next generation. One more conference I wanted to mention from the 2010s. In 2019, we had a conference in Berkeley held at the Latter-day Saint Institute there, which is sort of another model of where this place would find a home. It was a lovely conference, quite well attended by both people who came from elsewhere and the sort of strong Bay Area Latter-day Saint intellectual community. Um, in 2020, we'd arranged to rent the Sons of the Utah Pioneer space. They gave us very accessible pricing because they were interested in this sort of thing. And we're excited to try some different things for then. Of course, that was the year of the pandemic. And so we ended up not holding that conference and have mostly, I think since then, we've only done online conferences or joint conferences. Typically, with Mormon Scholars in the Humanities, we did have a couple Association for Mormon Letters related panels at a Mormon History Association conference the year that Claudia Bushman was president. The Bushmans were interested in kind of reaching out and involving more literature and arts people. Um, Okay, a few more thoughts quickly. Um, One thing that's happened in the literature, mostly in the 2020s, is a growing body of works available that are written in other languages and published in translation the Mormon Liblets, I think, kind of kicked it off in 2019, but then, people saw that this was possible, and Iriantum has had regular work published in translation. Wayfair would be another venue that's become more part of our community, and I think the internationalization of Mormon letters has been an important development just within those past 7 years or so. Obviously, people like Kent Larson were working earlier to encourage that. We'd mentioned Stephen Sondrup way back in the 80s, reaching out to Austria, but the frequency has increased and the personal connections. Um, and then one other point that I wanted to make is that I don't know, the critical mass of publications has increased to the point where I think it'd be easier to have critical discussion if and when academics decide to get more involved in that sort of discussion again. Um, Stephen Peck's 2009 novel, A Short Stay in Hell. It was just announced there will be a new edition coming out in Penguin's Vintage Classics series. So that's kind of the first example of something with a Latter-day Saint character by a Latter-day Saint writer dealing with imagery and themes from Mormon Imaginationscape has been in that sort of broader literary canon conversation. I was looking recently, and two of the top 20 best-selling authors of the 21st century are Latter-day Saints. That's Stephanie Meyer and Brandon Sanderson. Both of them, Mormonism arguably informs their work in many ways. Um, for a long time, there's been a stronger culture in the Latter-day Saint community of interest in our historical consciousness than our literary consciousness. But in the teens, 20 teens, and 2020s, um, it was really a time where skills that had been built and connections that had been forged through the Association for Mormon Letters changed the way the church talked about its history. I got hired at church history in 2013, and we ended up bringing on Scott Hales, Melissa Leilani Larson, Angela Hallstrom, Dave Nielsen. So at different times, lots of these fundamentally literary figures came through church history and helped shape the way that we talked about history in a way that I think is more emotionally accessible for people raised in a digital media environment where they expect some authenticity and complexity. It really was the writer's skills that helped bridge a cultural gap, and so I think this is also a moment where when we look back, we can say there was proof of concept that having a healthy literary dialogue ends up meeting needs of the community in ways that would not have been able to happen if it hadn't been for Chris getting Erie Anthem launched, for the people who kept the conferences going, and my main sort of regret looking back on this period is that some of us who were busy trying to creatively produce and get involved in the history community as well, have we done enough to preserve the institutional continuity in the Association for Mormon Letters? I'm hoping that one thing in the next decade we'll be able to say is that we address some of those issues and made it easier for people to meet and gather, be a part of each other's lives, and inform each other's creativity in ways that the larger Latter-day Saint community benefits from, even if it doesn't always know it's going to need them. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, James. Andrew, do you want to take a minute or two? We're kind of getting a little low on time, but
Yeah, no, I think James pretty much covered everything very
I
well
know
from that
James covered a
period.
lot really well.
Um, yeah, no, I'm good.
All right. Yeah, I think I was going to talk about one interesting thing in the last 10, 15 years is that we have some of these major national authors, you know, Shannon Hale as well. Interestingly, both Andy Ellis and Ali Condi have come and are teaching at BYU now, teaching as full-time professors that are nationally published authors that are LDS. Some of their fiction has LDS elements, some of it doesn't. I think Andy's has a little bit more. But obviously, their Mormonism informs that. I know Darlene Young is also teaching creative writing at BYU. And like James mentioned, I think one really wonderful thing going forward is the internationalization. you can find if you go back through, especially things like local publications, mission newsletters. Gabriel Gonzalez Nunez has done some good work with this, that there's been poetry and fiction from authors all over the world about Mormonism. Somebody much earlier in our conversation mentioned something about, might be Michael Austin or somebody who looks at Mormon literature as a subset of American literature. And I very respectfully want to say no. Like, I mean, I think historically it could have been seen that way, but I hesitate to view it that way because Mormonism is an international religion. I actually was just peeking at my phone. There's a WhatsApp group started by I think Raphael started. Anyway, there's a Facebook group associated with for Mormon authors. They're Spanish speaking, and I think there's 120 people in this WhatsApp group where they are giving each other advice. Many of them have ended up published in Orientum, published in the Mormon Lit Blitz. So that's wonderful. And for me personally, that was kind of I've been involved with AML since the early 2000s as a student at BYU, and I was an English major. And then I served a Spanish speaking mission and added a second major in Spanish literature. And I would honestly say for about 10, 15 years, I thought my Mormon literature interest and my Spanish literature interest did not intersect. And it's been a wonderful development in the last 5, 10 years that we can see much more of that. And all those same questions that others have talked about religion and literature from even more perspectives of what does it mean to be a Mexican Mormon or an Argentine Mormon or a German Mormon, and how does that show up in literature? Um, so
And
that's something
it
I
just
think.
it just so yeah, Gabriel Gonzalez Nunez had created this group that published a newsletter, and he was kind of a central person in finding these people. And then, like you say, Raphael, what's his full name?
I know I'm
Vasquez.
suddenly I can't. Yes,
Rafael
Rafael
Vasquez. So
Vasquez.
El
Yeah,
Pregonero de Deseret, the like town
yeah.
crier of Deseret, is
Mhm.
the Mario Montani, Gabriel Gonzalez Nunez, and Rafael have worked on that. And Rafael's writing workshop, I think, is just called Taller de Escritores, like writer's
Yeah.
workshop. But yeah, it's been a good place for nurturing Latter-day Saint writers and
Hmm.
doing that. I should mention too, Setlali Xochitl is somebody who is quite well established as a poet in Mexico and involved in poetry and cultural conferences there. Her father was a noted muralist. Um, I first knew her through the Mormon Lit Blitz by a prose poem called Tiempo, una partícula, that for my money is one of the finest, short pieces of Mormon literature we have. Just a beautiful, really moving meditation on atonement, but through the lens of 21st century social problems and struggles and so these really are, it's not just kind of a curiosity. This has become an integral part of the landscape.
Yeah, we James and I were on a panel in 2024, the Global Mormon Studies Network, which, tends to focus a little more on history and social science. But James and I were on a panel together with Raphael and Lali there in Mexico City at their conference, which was helpful because that can be one tricky thing about having things centered in the United States is authors and other people cannot always come and gather in person. So that was an opportunity. We did a panel about Mormon literature with Raphael and Lali there at Global Mormon Studies, and it was pretty well attended. We were all speaking in Spanish. It was a really wonderful opportunity because people are writing literature. They just may not know about AML or other Mormon authors. Sometimes people feel like they're discovering something new when we want to say we've been here for 50 years. We want you to join us. Bring what you have.
I do want to give a shout out reflecting on this time to two of the sort of Stephen Sondrip figures who were making everything work behind the scenes. One was Darlene Young, was the AML secretary for years and really involved in keeping things organized and together and happening. Now she's remembered as this, Mormon poet who's kind of one of the defining voices of our era. But she did work for years with the association before that and was an important person who could kind of spark conversation and help get people talking to each other. And then Andrew Hall, not only has he had a long tenure as the awards chair and helped keep the tradition going just by forcing those conversations about what's significant in each year. But for many years, he'd do like monthly news reports on what was happening in Mormon literature at a time when like there's been a lot happening, especially when you have this broad definition, and then later it kind of slowed down to more annual or
Well,
other
the
periods.
awards, as I got busy with the awards,
Right, like
the
you
monthly
can't
reports.
do
Yeah.
both. But no, Andrew was a really key figure through that period in keeping the association organized, um, making sure the awards happen, and just being aware to the point when the Center for Latter-day Saint Arts was organized, and Glenn Nelson asked me, like, okay, who knows literature? I said Andrew Hall, right? Like he's the one each of us who have been involved creatively or from a critical scholarly angle may have our angle of interest, but the best sort of panoramic view has been Andrew for the past 15, maybe 20 years now. So,
Thanks. Yep. I like being in the background and just making sure things are organized. The people who are smart and can speak well can have their chance to speak.
All right. I think we don't want to take too much more of anybody's time. Does anybody have any last closing thoughts, especially on what you hope to see in the future for AML or for Mormon literature, what you're looking forward to? If we can just take a minute or two.
Gideon.
I just wanted to chime in briefly. I'm glad that there's been some effort here to highlight many of the women who have been so central to AML over time. We're not reflecting that very well in this group here today. But I want to both remember those that have been key and also maybe think that maybe the future of AML might be a little bit less male and a little bit more female. I know we've had Margaret. There's Melissa Prophet, who also led us, and some very strong leaders in AML generally who have been women, but it has been male heavy.
yeah. Melissa Lilani Larson is another recent president. Yep.
And we talked about Levina, but early, I don't know that ever involved with the AML to a great extent, but Maureen Ursenbach Beecher was instrumental in helping, especially with journals and so forth. But anyway,
And
First president.
we should note it's interesting. She passed away just this year.
oh,
Maureen did, and so you have that 50-year thing. Eloise Bell, was she involved in the Association for Mormon Letters or just winning awards in the early years?
I don't remember. I don't think she was involved.
Okay.
She was a member, but I don't know
I thought she might have
for
done
how
a
many
humor
years.
column on AML list or something,
Mm.
or some kind of contributions there.
Linda Silito was a member in the very first year and for a good many years after that, and was
Yeah.
in the
And
writing.
Marilyn Brown was involved quite a bit.
Oh,
There was
Marilyn
a
was.
novel award for a while,
The
the Marilyn
writing.
Brown Novel Award.
Yeah.
She was another important person involved pretty
Cherry
heavily for quite a
Silver.
while.
Another person we should mention is Charlotte England. I moved to Utah just shortly after Gene England had passed, so he and I did not overlap at all. But I feel like sort of the way that memory and culture was transmitted to me was that for many years in the early 2000s, the award winners would gather for a reading and a social at the England home that Charlotte would always host. And she did a great job of, I don't know, helping people feel like that part of a community, right? That you weren't just somebody who'd written a work, but when she invited you into her home, she was also inviting you into a tradition and helping you feel like you belonged to this conversation, whichever of the many waters you happen to come from. And I had some good conversations with Charlotte over the years about essays I was working on or that kind of thing, how to position things and help reach people. So she's someone who I don't think was ever formally involved in any way, but in that hosting and storytelling function kind of helped the heart of the organization pass on.
Agreed.
I remember someone called Kathleen Dalton Woodbury.
Oh, I love her.
Seemed like she did a lot of stuff for AML over the years.
She was secretary and functioned a lot of the way that Darlene did in holding things together, right, John, during some of your years as well.
Yeah.
A lot of loose ends. There was a time when we had symposia, as we dared to call them, on the West Coast and the East Coast. I remember attending a West Coast symposium. So we've expanded and contracted over the decades. We are running up against our 7 p.m. time limit. I wanted to say that it seems to me maybe we ought to have another conversation sometime. Andrew, put this in the back of your mind. What's our unfinished business? I think there's an awful lot of unfinished business because I tend to be a literary critic mostly. I look at the criticism and I see a good deal that I think is not patient enough. Seems to me that patience and long suffering are among the guides to any Mormon literary criticism. Getting somehow LDS literary criticism of Mormon writers into a wider conversation, American or world lit, I don't care which way, really. I'm not aware of much of that that's ever been published. I did publish an article on 2 stories by Doug Thayer in Western American literature, mostly thanks to the fact that Levi was the editor that year, I think, although it narrowly missed getting an award. Somebody told me. I thought, well, shucks. We held conjoint meetings with RMMLA a great many times. It seems
That's the Rocky Mountain Mormon Literature or
Rocky Mountain
Modern Literature
Modern
Association.
Language Association.
Modern Language Association.
And I mean, I organized some of those, at least 1 or 2. I hope that AML can do more of that in going forward, not just let that drop out. Because I think Mike Austin, who, by the way, I think is probably the best Mormon critic practicing right now. Mike Austin has a point that a good deal of Mormon literature is a subset of American literature, or can at least be fruitfully read that way or connected that way. But I'm really glad to see, even though my capacities for foreign languages are highly limited, that we are at long last becoming more international. That was one of the first deficiencies that I thought I saw in the Craycroft Lambert anthology. No, hardly a hint that we were already then in the 70s an international church and a growing international church and culture, or multicultural of some sort. I don't know. So, and sometime, just for future reference, what's our unfinished business? I think we have a lot of it. I won't be here to see it pursued, or who knows.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you, Bruce. I think that's an important thing to note, that we've AML has been around for 50 years. We've been doing some wonderful work, and I love that idea of thinking about, okay, what's our unfinished business and what's our yet to be even thought of business that we can keep looking forward to. So thank you to all of you for being here for this wonderful discussion. I wish we could keep talking for hours, but I'm not sure that we cannot keep going, but we'll have to have more conversations. We'll have to keep talking about Mormon literature. And thank you so much for being here for this discussion. And we will let everybody go. So thank you.
Thank
Special
you so
thanks
much.
to
Thank you so
Andrew
much.
for organizing this.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank you.
thank you to
Levi,
Andrew for
I'm still
organizing it.